really shouldn't worry. I know it's scary, terrifying even being alone after so long, but it'll pass. All things do. And then it will be better. You'll see. Kira looked quizzically across her kitchen table at her older brother, Tony. He'd aged in the 4 years since she'd last seen him. His now receding hair flecked with grey, and his once toned physique had succumbed to his age and somewhat indulgent lifestyle. But he was, in every other way, still essentially the same, still possessed of the disarming smile and easy nature that had made him popular with all her friends when they were young. But this version of him, giving relationship advice, was new to her, and while she appreciated his efforts, she considered that it wasn't really his thing. He'd always been single and proud of it, boasting that he was married to beer and football whenever the subject of his solitary existence came up. I know what you're saying is probably true, but it doesn't feel like that, she replied. I know James. I know what he's like, how stubborn he was. But I can't actually believe he just left me like that. I can't believe it even after all this time. She stopped in frustration. The things she wanted to say still didn't come out of her mouth easily. That he had someone else already lined up, Tony asked. Kira nodded reluctantly. It's been 6 months, he followed. You need to move on. You need to put yourself first for once and forget about him, for good. I don't know if I can, she said wistfully, her brow tense in an expression that spoke of desperation and the need she harbored within her for resolution. If only he'd said that day, said he had someone else, I could hate him, but to just walk out, to leave me not knowing, worrying about him, loving him. It's unbearable. Tony reached out and put his hand on hers. You do know he's probably just getting his head straight. You know how flaky he is. He'll probably walk through that door one day soon as if nothing has happened. Kira half smiled at his attempt at giving comfort, as her eyes welled with tears. Oh, I don't think so, she said in a slow, resigned tone. I think he's gone for good, and I'm not sure I'd ever want him back now anyway. You know, when they looked for him, when half the town was out searching the hills, part of me wishes that they'd found him dead in some ditch, because then I'd still have him, even if he were just a grave. He would still belong to me. Tony bit his lip. Yeah, I can imagine, he said. I'm just sorry I wasn't here for you. Working overseas all the time is starting to bug me, especially when it means not being here when you need me. And besides, I need to be here for when he does get bored of the bed he's crawled off to. If you can't forgive him, maybe I can put the snake in a hospital bed instead. It's not like he doesn't deserve it. She laughed, while 2 teardrops fell into her coffee cup. Well, if he really did go off with his secret lover, I might just take you up on that offer, she replied. He's nothing but a bastard for doing this to me. But the flicker of humour in the moment passed as quickly as it arrived, as her mind was filled with the worry and memories that had plagued her from the very day her husband left, namely that he had taken his own life in some fit of despair. She knew James was prone to brief episodes of depression, but he'd been fine for ages before that fateful day, the day they had a huge row about something so trivial that she could barely remember what it was about. But it got out of control. Things were said that shouldn't have been. "What am I even doing here?" she had shouted. It wasn't thought through. It was just the vent of frustration, just words. James had replied with, "So you want to call it a day, then? Is that what you mean?" She never replied to that question. She was too angry, and he walked out, like he'd done so many times before when they'd had one of their rows, slammed the door behind him, never to be seen again. The police looked for a while. They told her that this kind of thing happens quite a lot, how people leave relationships and don't want to be found, and that they usually turn up years later, having started a new life somewhere far away. But Kira couldn't believe that of him. 12 years they'd been married, and they'd been dating for 8 before that. No matter what they'd been through, she trusted him, her childhood sweetheart. Trusted him to tell her the truth, and to Kira. He was her soulmate, almost like the reflection of her essence. When they were together, it was like two halves of a shell made whole, as if the real her included part of him and vice versa. He'd said it himself so many times in darkened nights of passion, gazing into her eyes, that she was his princess, his reason for living, and that somewhere in the heavens they were a star together. They had even been trying for a baby, after years of putting it off, so they could enjoy their lives together first. And then he simply walked away. "We're hitting the town tonight," Tony then said, interrupting her momentary sorrowful recollection. "It's just me and the guys, sort of a welcome home, drink yourself under the table kind of thing, and you should come along." Kira frowned. "Well, maybe," she replied hesitantly. "I'll have to see how I feel. It's not really my kind of thing." The thought of a night in the company of his old crew, drunken, loud, and probably way over-familiar, just didn't have much appeal at that moment to Kira. Tony shrugged. "Well, I've got to go. Got to sort out all the damage that so-called friend of mine did to my apartment while I was gone. But call me if you want to come along. You've got to go out sometime, and now's as good a time as any." Kira nodded reluctantly and walked him to the door. They hugged, and then he left. As she turned, she caught her reflection in her hallway mirror, and a thought flashed through her mind. "I look older too," her inner voice said. She moved a little closer. "It must be the light," she thought as she pulled the skin at the corner of her eyes, such that her ever-so-fine crow's feet disappeared somewhat. They seemed far more noticeable than ever before, though, and then she saw them. 2 hairs greying at the roots. It was always something she'd been so proud of, her long brown hair, always preened, always perfect, even in the depths of despair, yet there they were, screaming out. "I'm getting old," she whispered, her very next thought being that she was going to rush and buy some hair dye. "You can forget going out," she then said out loud as she moved but inches away from the mirror, frantically scanning for any other blemish or flaw that might have suddenly decided to inflict itself upon her. And then it struck her, a terrible thought that infused her mind like a creeping poison, that James had stolen her youth, her best years, as if he had had his pleasure at her expense, and then run away to find some new younger skin on which his eyes could pleasure themselves. And an image then flashed into her mind of James shacked up with some younger woman, some woman 10 years his junior, some flawless vision of youth. "He's a shit," she hissed as she turned and headed off back to the kitchen to get herself a fresh coffee. "He's right," she said to herself, as she stood sipping, staring into her garden. "I need to move on. I need to get that a-hole out of my life, out of my heart. But how?" she thought. It certainly wasn't going to happen on sweaty nights with team lager, she mused. Then it came to her, a first step, a small step, but one that at least might move her in that direction. There was a place, one place, that was hers and James's, their special place, up in the woods of Old Compton Forest, up at the top of Compton Hill, a place hardly anyone ever visited, overgrown and almost impenetrable. But there was a secret twisting path through the woods for those who knew, and at the top there was an outcrop, mostly flat and cut away by the slope of the hill on one side, where as teenage sweethearts on many days and nights she and James had snuck away to lie on their stone bed, lost, intoxicated in each other, far from the prying eyes of parents. From the day James had left, she couldn't even look in the direction of the hill, couldn't imagine going there. Too many happy memories that would only bring pain. But now she wanted to, had to. She wanted to journey to that wood, to that stone, and spit on it. She put on her boots, threw on her coat, and stormed out to her car, tearing away up the road filled with a rage that she hadn't wanted, hadn't been able to express. And now she was having to restrain it, to restrain herself from driving the gas pedal to the floor, to restrain herself from finding out where James now lived and delivering her car straight into his living room. Minutes later she arrived at the gateway that was the start of the footpath that led away into the trees of Old Compton. She pulled up on the muddy verge, and then was out and walking. The bluebell flowers were out. She'd never thought of it, but in happier times she and James had always visited the place in spring just to see them. Always walked to their secret hideaway. to remember and relive the romance of youth. But today hearts and flowers were not what she was here for. She mused that she would not mind a storm coming and lashing those happy plants to crumpled stumps. She advanced up the hill, ever higher, and although she was doing her best to deny it, the very being of the place was, to her mind, all about them, all about her and James, about their love. She threw it off. "Bastard, bastard, bastard, bastard," she said with every step. And then she stopped. It wasn't working. She couldn't be in this place and hate him. Just get to the top, she said to herself, and let it go, and let it go. In a time, eventually, she made it through the twisted secret pathway, through hawthorn and brambles that kept the curious at bay with barb and thorn, until she was at the top, stood still, looking down on that cold, flat, sandstone outcrop that had been and still was but crippled, sacred ground to her heart. And then she broke, tears, a torrent, uncontrollable, months of pain, utter pain released. She fell to her knees and then flat, her teardrops staining beneath, as she brushed her fingers against what was once Mother Nature's gift, now nothing more than cold and bitter stone. She cried until her lungs hurt, until she could cry no more, and slipped into a mournful, bereft, almost trance-like state. And she lay still and silent as the sound of the forest washed over her, the sound of the whispered breeze blowing through the new leaves, the sweetest bird call laced within it. She stood. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. "Goodbye, my prince," she said as she turned. Trembling words, spoken half to the essence of James, that still seemed to inhabit the place, and half to that great stone, for it to keep secret within its being, as it had once kept their love secret. As she retraced her steps, she began to be overwhelmed by a new emotion, that of embarrassment. Embarrassed that there, for all the world to see, she had been snubbed, cast aside, treated as worthless. He had been her all, and clearly to him she was nothing, had been nothing, and her anger returned, and with it, for the first time, what felt like real embers of hatred. She screamed out at the top of her lungs, "Bastard!" and the shock of the sound seemed to send the forest into a moment of hushed silence. And it was then, almost as if in reply, she heard it, fleeting, faint, and far away. At first she thought she imagined it. Then it drifted through the trees again. It was the sound of a flute, a single flute, played with such delicate precision, so evocative, so emotional. Who could be playing something so beautiful, she thought. In all the time she'd been to this place, she'd never heard anything like it, never heard any music, in fact. But this was not like any music. It almost seemed to emerge and meld with the sounds around her. It ebbed and flowed as one, ephemeral, spiritual even. It sounded to Kira like peace given note. She stood mesmerized on the foot-worn earthen path that led through that sun-dappled wonder of impossible shades of green, mesmerized because suddenly she could barely remember why she was there. It was as if that sweet music had taken away all her pain, as if all that had happened simply evaporated from her mind, vanished from within her. Without conscious thought, she began to walk again, not to return home, but instead to find the source of this audible wonder, and for this intent her steps were light and effortless as she descended. She came to the main path that led through the forest and crossed it onto another that in all her years she had never seen before. Soft beech leaves were then brushing against her face, caressing her skin as she walked along it, as that flute played ever louder, ever more enchanting and melodic with each step. And the beauty around her became ever more intense, the light more golden, the forest more verdant. And then she came to a stone wall, weathered, crumbling, moss-covered, and so very old. And in that wall was set a wrought iron gate, half open, long since embraced in ivy. She squeezed past, and beyond lay more thick wood, tall pines, and great boulders covered in moss, glistening in the dancing sunlight. Then down some earthen steps, the source of those sweet notes, now so near. Then a lake came into view, its surface so still that the blue of the sky and the wisps of cloud within it were reflected upon its surface like some perfect work of art. Willows on one side, oak and birch on the other. A few more steps, and then she could see that an island lay at the center of that lake. A long, thin, odd-looking canoe pulled up onto it. In the center of that island lay a small, single flowering tree, and beneath that tree, leaning back upon it, in its shade, sat a man, facing away from her slightly. From what she could see, he was bare-chested and barefoot, wearing nothing but long green shorts, and in his hands lay a flute pressed to his lips, and his body swayed as if lost in the sweet melody he so deftly crafted. Kira knelt and then lay down near the water's edge, concealed somewhat behind the low branches of a sapling, and there she closed her eyes and bathed in that audible ecstasy. It cleansed her, washed into the darkest corners of her soul, and set her free to be within her own flesh once more, as if for so long she had lived far away, in a place within, far away in the shadows of despair. And everything for Kira faded to bliss as sleep washed over her. A flapping, wet, lolloping tongue slapped against her lips. "Are you lost?" a male voice whispered in her ear. Kira's eyes instantly juddered open, and for a horrible moment she imagined some man was taking some gross advantage of her prone state. But that thought evaporated instantly with heavy panting and the unmistakable sensation of a dog's muzzle in her face. "Come away, Gar. Stop that," the unknown voice continued in a smooth, comforting tone. Kira put out her hands, half to fend off the slobbering assault, and half to lift herself up a little, as her eyes opened fully, struggling to see in the haze of sunlight and green. The wagging tail of a small beige-coloured dog was the first thing to greet her, as Gar turned away at his master's request, allowing her to then just make out a face before her, a face that then came into focus, and her first thought was, wow. She knew instantly that it was the man from the island, and he was leaning over her. But now she could see what he was truly like, and he was like no man she'd ever seen before. Fascinating in appearance, and to her way of thinking, astoundingly handsome. His hair sun-bleached and long, his skin bronzed, his features rugged, yet to Kira's mind perfect. A collection of odd-looking stone, feather, and tooth pendants around his neck only served to enhance his unconventional appearance, but it was his almost radiant green eyes that truly captivated her. She was instantly entranced by them. They seemed to contain all that she needed to know of his character, for they conveyed a gentle kindness, humour, strength, and sensuality, all in the same fleeting moment. Yes," she stuttered as she sat up. I got lost, and I wandered came in through the—" She was struggling to remember exactly where she was or how she got here. He gave a huff of a laugh. "Don't worry," he interjected, as he handed a small treat to his pet, who was now seated as if expecting the reward. "It's no problem your being here. Gar just loves to find our visitors, especially when I play the flute. It tends to draw people, you see, and it's a bit of a game for him." With that, Gar scampered off, darting to and fro, as if continuing his search for any other wanderers that might be hiding in the undergrowth. Despite the peculiarity of the situation, his gentle tone put Kira at ease, the kind of ease that comes with familiarity, the familiarity you have with a friend you've known and trusted for years. "He's so cute," Kira said, as she watched little Gar in his frantic searching dance through the wood. "Does he find many people, then, when you play?" The stranger smiled as he sat down, cross-legged on the warm earth. "Well, he has found 3 or 4 on a good day before now." "That doesn't surprise me," she answered. "You're quite the amazing musician. You should be on a stage." "I am in a way. For many years this forest has been my stage. and today I was privileged to play for an audience of one." "I think I was the one who was privileged," she replied. "I can't believe I've never heard you play before, and I can't believe I never knew about this place either. It's so beautiful." He gave a broad grin. "I guess you could say it's a well-kept secret. Those who know about it don't talk about it." "I can see why," she answered as her eyes consumed the visual feast of color and perfection before her. "There are so many flowers. How are there so many flowers? Do you plant them?" she asked, turning back to him. "I'd have been a very busy guy if I had," he replied. "I guess only nature can make somewhere like this," she said, somewhat reverently. "Do you own it? I only ask because I'd really like to come here again if that's possible." "Well, I do have the key to that old gate you came through," he answered, "so I suppose you could say I do. But I'm more like its custodian, its protector, if you like. But by all means, feel free to come again whenever you like. Just keep it between us, though." The conversation then faltered for a moment as her eyes were drawn to a dove that landed but feet away, seemingly oblivious to their presence, as it picked up small twigs with which to make its nest. "I've got to go. I can't quite remember why," she then said, turning once more to meet his eyes as the bird flew away. "I know there's something I've got to do, I think. But being here, I don't know, it's made it go right out of my head. Well, if you do come again, my name's Finn. It's short for Phineas," he said, sweeping his long hair back off his face. "My religious parents thought it would suit me." Kira smiled. "I think it does," she replied wistfully with a smile. "My name's Kira. That's a beautiful name. It suits you perfectly," he answered. Kira looked down and blushed. She hadn't blushed since she was in her young teens. "I must go," she then said hurriedly, as she rose to her feet. "Well, it really was lovely to meet you, Kira, and to do come again." She turned and walked a little too speedily away, acutely aware that she was on the verge of being overwhelmed by her nerves. Since James had left, she hadn't really been around any men that she had really liked, and that she could have ever considered dating. But although this Phineas was clearly unusual, eccentric even, she was attracted to him in ways she had come to imagine might never take hold of her again, and it scared her. Soon she was back at the gate, the sound of Phineas's flute playing her out, then upward along a barely discernible track, until she once more returned to the main path through the forest. But when she saw it, she stopped, almost froze in her tracks, because she couldn't bring herself to step onto it. It was as if it represented something to her, as if it represented a return to all the misery and suffering she had known, that she had forgotten about in her brief time by that lake, in that secret place. The sound of the flute had faded, and she strained to hear it. She didn't want to lose the strange comfort of it quite yet. And then she realized that she couldn't walk away, not yet. She could not go back to her miserable existence. She had to stay longer, all night if necessary, for days if need be, maybe even until hunger drove her to that place that was no longer a home, but a loveless prison. She turned. She meant to walk, but her steps were strides, and then she was running because she feared the gate would be locked by the time she arrived, that Finn would be gone, and she would have no choice but to leave. Then, eventually, through the overhanging branches, she could see what by now seemed almost like salvation. That metal gateway, still open. She rushed to it, and then she was in, and stopped. She closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and listened. Phineas was not playing his flute, but the birds were still singing over that web of sweet silence. She breathed deep, drew in the peace of that place once more, and then opened her eyes and walked slowly onward until she came to the water's edge. Phineas was nowhere to be seen. The sun still shimmered on the water, a dragonfly skitting across its surface. "I knew you'd return," came a soft, familiar voice from over her shoulder. Kira didn't jump in response. She mused in that very moment if his voice could ever be shocking. Such was the tranquility within it. She turned. Phineas was but feet away. His flute, strung with a cord, sung over his shoulder. In one hand he held a large, twisted wooden staff, in the other a sprig of blossom from a tree. "How did you know?" Kira replied. "I could see it in your eyes," he said. "The pain that brought you here. The pain you're trying to forget." She sighed. "You're very perceptive," she said, turning back to the lake to hide her sorrows. "Who was he?" "The one who hurt you." Kira winced. She didn't really want to talk about it. Not here. "No one," she replied. "At least they turned out to be." Those words melted into a moment of silence in which Kira relented a little in her reluctance to reveal. "He was my husband," she whispered. "And yes, I've got to forget him. He must be a very foolish man to have left you," came the reply, eliciting a flicker of a tortured smile on Kira's face. "I'll tell you what," Phineas continued. "We can row out to the island if you like. I can play some music and we can just sit a while." Kira nodded and turned. "I'd like that," she answered. As she said those words, she knew inwardly that it was rash to trust him so easily, but he was so good-looking, so charming and disarming in his manner that she just couldn't imagine there being any harm in him. They were soon beneath a large cherry tree, its branches pendulous with pink flowers, hanging over the lake, dropping the occasional petal onto its surface. And there, awaiting, was a small flat-bottomed boat into which Kira clambered, followed closely by Phineas. He knelt down and picked up the single paddle lying in the bottom of it, and with it moved them across the water to their destination. What a beautiful tree! Kira said as she stepped carefully off the boat and onto the small island. "It is impressive, isn't it?" Phineas replied. "It's an apple. All those blossoms will be sweet fruit in but a few months. You'll have to go and pick some." Kira shot him a glance, her eyes bright with expectation. Not so much of the fruit, but more of the implication that she would be welcome. "But I do hope you'll return many times before then," he continued. "I think I will," she replied, as her eyes lingered in his gaze. "Do you think it's fate?" he asked. "Fate that let you find this place today? I think sometimes life lets us find what we most need when we most need it." Kira huffed. "I used to think that James and I were fated to be together, so I don't have much faith in such things." Phineas flickered a knowing smile. "Yes, the cruel fates do like to play tricks with us, don't they?" He then put his flute to his lips, and staring out across the water, played a brief and to Kira's ear exquisite and ever so slightly mournful melody. He paused and looked at her, his eyes shining bright in the reflected light. "Do you ever regret meeting him, loving him?" Kira lowered her head. It was a question that still hurt her to even think of the answer, for all her anger, for all the insult and sorrow. She still, somewhere deeper down, loved him. She shook her head, to which Phineas returned a flinched expression, as if the knowledge pained him. Then Kira sighed. "I don't know," she said, trying to mitigate what seemed almost instantly to be an embarrassing admission. To admit that she could be treated so badly and yet remain loyal in any way to the means of her ridicule. "Look at that," Phineas interjected in a jolly tone. "The nectar of the apple tree. I haven't seen that for so long. Such a rare thing." He reached up, and there, hanging from a flower, from a single stamen, was one drop of pure clear liquid, which he took upon the back of his index finger, and then offered that drop to Kira to taste, with the words, "Try it." She had no hesitation, letting the tip of her tongue brush against that shimmering droplet, and instantly it was as if upon her tongue every sweet taste she had ever known had combined into one exquisite, consuming abandon of sensual pleasure. The taste so infused her spirit that she felt like she could do anything. She wanted to strip naked and run around that blossoming tree in celebration. She wanted to dive into the waters around them and swirl and swim like some manic dolphin. She felt like she could just unfurl her arms and fly to the heavens, but instead of any of that, she simply burst into tears, crying uncontrollably, wailing without restraint, at which Phineas simply returned to his musical muse, as if Kira's state of emotional collapse required no response as if it was not wholly unexpected. Eventually, her weeping subsided, and with it, his playing. An interesting taste, isn't it? It has made me cry with joy before now. Kira looked at him, still in awe at the gift he had given her, a taste she never dreamed could exist. "I don't know why I did that," she stuttered. "It's the pure honesty of nature," he replied. "It makes us see things the way they really are. You've buried your grief, your sorrow, but you can't hide it here." Kira wiped her eyes on the cuff of her sleeve as her brow furrowed. "What is this place?" she asked quizzically. "Is it real? Or is this just some beautiful dream I'm having?" Phineas's eyes widened. "If this is a dream, then what lies back home in the life that waits for you there?" "A nightmare," she answered. He reached out and laid his fingers gently on the back of her hand. "Your husband was a fool. Wherever he is, I'm sure he regrets leaving you. If I were him, I'd have treated you like the precious flower you are." She felt herself blushing once again. 20 years of nothing, and then twice in a day, she thought as she raised her right hand to her cheek in a feeble attempt to conceal the return of youthful embarrassment. "I come here to forget, too," he continued, as he drew his hand away. "To forget someone who broke my heart. But today, for the first time, strangely, I feel like they've finally gone." Kira returned his affectionate act, placing her hand then upon his. "She must be a fool, too," she whispered. Phineas smiled widely and looked into her eyes. "I think the fates really are shining on us this time," he said. "So do I," she replied. They sat in silence for a moment that to Kira's mind was wonderful. "Maybe, sometime soon, we should meet here again," he said, soft and slow. "I'd like that," Kira answered, her heart racing ever so slightly. Phineas reached and plucked a small cluster of flowers from the apple tree. "And maybe, one day, well, maybe," he said, as he slid the stem of the flower cluster into her hair. Kira's smile was radiant as she nodded ever so slightly as her mind was filled with the muse of what his words meant. That they might become lovers, that he might carry her away in passion and love, that she might be lost in him. But then her thoughts were flooded with the image of James returning, of him having had amnesia, of him having been abducted or recovered from some terrible illness, and how he could just walk back into her life, expecting her to be waiting, expecting her heart to still be his. She shook her head as tears welled in her eyes at the thoughts. "I want to, but I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I ever can, until I know for sure. You still love him, don't you? He whispered. Kira nodded slowly. He huffed knowingly in response. I thought you did, but well. You can't blame me for trying. No, can you? A sympathetic smile flashed for an instant at the corners of her mouth. Yes, it's unfortunate, he said, as he stood and slung his flute over his shoulder. I guess I best just leave alone, then. Kira panicked ever so slightly. She hadn't intended to hurt his pride or even to reject him wholeheartedly. I didn't mean it to sound harsh. I just meant I'm not quite ready to give up. I still hope, she said in a slightly chaotic attempt to take the edge off her words. He laughed, ever so mockingly. Hope. It's the downfall of mankind, you know, he said, while looking down at her, sweeping his long hair aside. But it's fine, he whispered. The sun's setting anyway, so it really is time I left. Kira was a little relieved by his comforting smile, and she moved to rise also. But when she tried to stand, she couldn't. I knew I shouldn't have sat cross-legged. I can't get up, she exclaimed, with a twang of humour. Phineas's smile widened. It's a pity you chose to stay. It could have been so very intense. We could have been. What do you mean? I haven't chosen to stay. I just can't move, she replied, laughing nervously, and slightly panicking as she tried to manually move her left leg. But it was not only completely numb, but locked, rock solid. Can you just give me a hand? To pull me up, she stammered. I'm afraid not, he answered hesitantly as he reached out and brushed his fingers tenderly across her cheek. You see, you love him, and he loves you, and it's all just too late for us. Kira blinked, the rippling light reflecting off the water onto his face was playing tricks with her mind, with her eyes. It looked just as if his eyes had changed, just like the eyes of a goat, she thought to herself for a split second. What do you mean, us? There isn't an us, she answered, barely able to conceal her anger and confusion at his ridiculous assertion. You are correct, he said, smooth and slow, moving his face closer. But there could have been, if only you could let yourself go. Kira made the sudden realization that whatever was holding her fast, it was something to do with Phineas. Maybe he's used some subtle hypnosis, or maybe he's some grubby stage mentalist, her mind considered, in a frenzied, fear-driven flow of thought. I think I've been too hasty. I didn't really mean what I said, she sputtered. I was just being cautious. I like you. I think we should see each other. I'm ready to move on. Really? Phineas inquired, his strange-looking eyes wide, cocking his head to the side like some confused dog. But you said You loved him, and now you say you don't, even though he's right here with us. That's not very nice, Kira, he said, laughing. Kira's breathing was short, her lips and hands trembling uncontrollably, her mouth so dry she could barely form words in it. What do you mean? Why would you say something so cruel? The tree, of course, Phineas replied. Can't you see him? Oh my God, you're insane. I mean, yes, I can see him. He's right there. Please, I don't like him. I need to go. She struggled frantically to free her legs, now resorting to hitting them in a futile attempt to spark them to life. Phineas gave a deep laugh, brimming with derision. You really would say anything, wouldn't you? Your kind should learn the value of honesty, most of all with yourselves. Remember how you told yourself you could get over him. Well, that was a lie, wasn't it, Kira? Look, there he is, he said, pointing to the center of the apple's trunk. You can tell him yourself. Sick with almost paralyzing terror, she lifted her head and let her gaze follow his pointed finger, and there, right in the center of the tree, was the contorted, tortured face of James. She flung up her hands to grip her face and let out the most blood-curdling scream that echoed through the empty woods, at the end of which Phineas said, cool and slow, That's no way to greet your love. And with those words, the face of James faded back into the bark. On jagged breaths, Kira could barely manage to ask, What have you done? What are you? As she turned her gaze towards him, he stepped forward such that the sun was behind him, and she was sure there silhouetted, it looked just as if he had long, curled horns sweeping back from his forehead. Well, I really haven't done anything, he replied, but I do know that little James regretted his hasty decision to storm out on you like some petulant child that day he left. I heard his whispering it over and over as he lay wedged between two rocks, blood oozing from a head wound, so ironic that he fell to his death, but feet from that place, so cherished to you both. Kira swallowed, the only sign of life from her frozen form, her eyes wide in consuming horror. He called your name, begged, then whispered over and over how he loved you, and then everything faded and he found himself walking alone in the woods, trying to find his way back to you. And then he heard the voice of a woman singing a song so beautiful that he could not resist following it. They never can, you know. At first he thought it was you, but then he met her, a woman of unfailing unfathomable beauty, and in her seductions he almost gave his heart, gave his lust. But he resisted, told her he couldn't, because he loved you, because you, he said, are his soul mate. We do know fate, though, you see. We knew you'd be along eventually, and we knew you'd be stricken by grief on that sacred stone, where you shared so much passion. It amused us how your kind came looking for him, came when the land was covered in snow, and then barely searched. You'd think they'd know not to look for a corpse in bitter ice. They should have come when the ground had melted, when the maggots crawl, and then just followed their little noses. You'll be ripe when they come looking, and they'll probably think it's so romantic, you both dying, but feet from each other. Please, please don't kill me, Kira whispered. I'm not going to kill you, my dear. I don't need to. You're already dead. When you lay down on that rock, you had a dream, and it brought you to me. And here you made your choice. And then the light within your little body went out, and you died of a broken heart, as so many do. I'm not dead. I'm alive. This is a dream, isn't it? I need to wake up. I need to wake up, she said in crushing terror. I'm afraid it's too late for that, he replied. Your body is already going stiff and cold as stone. And besides, look down. Kira struggled to lower her gaze. It was as if her whole body was gripped with rigidity. But then she could see, and what she saw so terrified her that she went to scream once more, but she merely choked on the sound as it tried to escape her throat. For there beneath her were not legs, but the twisted, winding, thorn-bedecked trunk of a rose bush. Her gaze shot back to Phineas, her dread-laden eyes imploring him. She tried to speak, to beg him for mercy, but no sound came, save for two barely audible words. You can't. And then silence, as around her face she could only watch, powerless, as blood-red petals emerged. Phineas seemed to increase in stature, as if inflated in pride at what he had done to her. You are not the master here, my dear, sweet Kira. Your kind never are. And besides, you'll make this island so beautiful. Two lovers forever bound, he the apple, and she the rose. You'll never leave each other again, never squabble like little children, you'll never break each other's hearts again. He reached out with his hand and stroked a petal at the side of her mouth, and with that she dissolved into a sea of red. I will return, my little rose, and maybe in 1,000 years or 2, who knows, maybe I'll let you try again. A pair of doves, perhaps, and then again, maybe not. You do, after all, make such an exquisite flower, do you not, my sweet Kira? And with that he leant forward and kissed that deep red bloom so very softly. And then he stood, smiled in profound satisfaction, and then placed his flute to his lips, there crafting a new melody, while he walked slowly away over the surface of the water on his great cloven hooves, as the sun set on a little corner of paradise.